Hello, this is Başak Ergil from Istanbul, and I'll be giving a talk entitled Revisiting a Mosaic of Sculpted Turkish Poetry, Creativity, Translatability, and Translatorial Agency through Translational Recanonization. The complexity of agency of the translator has brought about many old and new questions and debates addressing the role, responsibility, and freedom of the translator, acting and deciding across languages, cultures, traditions, canons, and norms. These debates have welcomed even newer parameters and perspectives as interdisciplinary, multimodal, and intergenre translation practices made new research models and methods necessary. In this talk, I will problematize the agency of the translator within what I will call a cross-semiotic retranslational recanonization. My case study is an exhibition of sculpted poetry, Esin mi Şeytan mı, Inspiration or Evil, a group sculpture exhibition which opened on March 21st, 2012 in Istanbul to celebrate World Poetry Day and was co-organized by Işık University and Writers Syndicate of Turkey, an established union of writers founded as early as 1974. I will particularly look at the agency of the sculptor-translator, in terms of the concept of creativity. The sculptor here, in this very example, is an agent of cross-semiotic translational recanonization. So, to come to this concept, first I will refer to Roman Jakobson's notion of inter-semiotic translation, which was a departure point leading to my coinage of a new concept, cross-semiotic translational recanonization, within a large frame of translational recanonization. So, to illuminate my discussion further, I will focus on two sculpted renderings of Nâzım Hikmet's poem, Angina Pektoris, and I will conclude by arguing that the agency of the sculptor-translator is characterized by his or her creativity and freedom to interpret, and is interventive in terms of its relation to urban poetics and public sphere. The translatability of the source text, the poem, depends largely on the creativity of the sculptor-translator. So I'd like to start my theoretical and conceptual discussion by problematizing the concept of intersemiotic translation, which was put forward by Roman Jakobson in 1959 and was then a big contribution that entailed an extended understanding and conception of translation as a phenomenon beyond mere linguistic transfer. In his tripartite model, Jakobson labels three kinds of translation: intralingual translation or rewording, which is addressed as an interpretation of verbal signs by means of other signs of the same language; interlingual translation or translation proper, which is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of some other language; and intersemiotic translation or transmutation, which is addressed as an interpretation of verbal signs by means of signs of nonverbal sign systems. The concept of intersemiotic translation has not been without critical responses since the time it was coined, 1959. We have witnessed many changes and developments in translation studies. So, the linguistically oriented nature of Jakobson's concept of intersemiotic translation requires new methodological and conceptual discussions, especially in terms of multimodality of translation. Berk Albachten and Tahir Gürcablar emphasize the linguistic bias of Jakobson's conceptualization and categorization. I quote, "Although Roman Jakobson's category of intersemiotic translation has been around for a long time and has been used productively in various forms of translation research, today the term falls short of describing the increasingly complex and rich texts that have become a part of translation landscape. Jakobson's well-known tripartite categorization of translation as interlingual, intralingual, and intersemiotic carries a linguistic bias evident from the way all three categories take as their starting point the interpretation of the verbal sign. And some other further critical responses and reservations on the use of intersemiotic translation are discussed, and an alternative term, cross-semiotic retranslational recanonization, is put forward by Ergil. The two reservations motivating the coinage of a new concept are as follows. The first one is the lack of a systemic approach to the act of translation. I quote, "Study of canons brings about a systemic approach to the analysis of intercanonical acts and interactions. Intersemiotic translation, however, is used for single examples and acts of translation." And the second reservation is the necessity for a more extensive connotation and, of course, for a more extensive frame which will embrace this connotation. So the concept of cross-semiotic retranslational recanonization is embedded in a larger frame, a larger conceptual frame of translational recanonization. So I quote, "Translational recanonization, in a way, includes but is not limited to intersemiotic translations and interactions. It has a more, it has a wider, it has a more extensive and a more historicized and contextualized canonical perspective." So, to look at that larger frame of translational recanonization, how translational recanonization works and how it is addressed, translational recanonization is the act of reintroducing a text or a cultural artifact into another national or transnational cultural canon. A cultural canon consists of many kinds of canons, like musical canon, literary canon, etc. In the case of translational recanonization of literary texts, the product is either reintroduced to the same kind of canon. For example, a translated poem is reintroduced to the canon as a translated poem, or it is reintroduced to a different kind of canon in the same target cultural canon. For example, a poem is translated and introduced as a song. It must be noted that cultural canon in this very context refers to all traditional forms as well as new and digital forms, including ebooks, hypertexts, digital culture, and blogosphere, which contribute to the making, transformation, and maintaining of canons. So within the larger frame of translational recanonization, there are two related concepts to be used while looking into translations across genres and modalities, and they are defined as follows. These two terms, two concepts are cross-genre retranslational recanonization and cross-semiotic retranslational recanonization. I quote, "The former being a recanonization in a different genre, as a novel into a poem, and the latter being recanonization in a different mode or sign system, such as a novel translated into a movie. A cross-semiotic retranslational recanonization is usually, but not always, also cross-genre. Again, I quote, cross-semiotic retranslational recanonization is usually possible through what Roman Jakobson calls intersemiotic translation, and it allows the introduction of a non-literary text. Well, it doesn't allow the introduction, but it allows the discussions on introduction of a non-literary text into literary canons or a literary text into non-literary canons, such as a musical canon or a film canon. And there is a footnote here, I quote, here I propose the prefix cross, where Jakobson would use inter as in intersemiotic, in order to emphasize that the source text is likely to actively cross the borders and border lines to step into a target cultural canon and autonomously coexist there. So, about translational recanonization, questioning the agency of the translator within, between, and across canons. Another methodological advantage of looking from the notion of translational recanonization is because, one, it regards canons as dynamic entities and organisms. And of course, dynamic, by dynamic, we also mean interactive. Two, I quote, the recanonization of a translated work is evaluated in the light of intercanonical, intracanonical, and even extra-canonical dynamics. And thirdly, the concept of translational recanonization allows the researcher to examine and question the agency of the translator, in this case, translator-sculptor, from a more contextualized perspective as an agent acting not only between canons, but also within, without, and across canons. So the case study that I will be focusing on is Esin mi Şeytan mı? Inspiration or Evil, a group sculpture exhibition, as I've previously mentioned, a group sculpture exhibition which opened on March 21st, 2012 in Istanbul to celebrate World Poetry Day and was co-organized by Işık University and Writers Syndicate of Turkey, an established union of writers founded as early as 1974. The exhibition hosted 37 sculptures of 36 Turkish poems, because one poem that I will be focusing on here has been translated or sculpted twice by two different sculptor translators. So the exhibition hosted 37 sculptures of 36 Turkish poems and was the first time in Turkey that poetry was represented and recanonized in sculpture form. Most of the poems in the exhibition belong to 20th century Republican era Turkish poets. Besides the exhibition, the project involved a panel on the process of creation in arts, a poetry reading, and the publication of the exhibition catalog, which makes all of these events some urban and publication, further publication and recanonization events as well. So I'd like to go on by giving some examples from the exhibition. This is the poem Pergel by Ömer Khayyam, and is named Pergel, the drawing compass. The sculptor is Ayla Turan, and it's made of bronze and wood. The second example is Çocukluk. The source text poem is Çocukluk by Cahit Sıtkı Tarancı, who is an early Republican Turkish poet. And it is translated, or it is rendered as sarılmış, embraced by Arif Çekderi by means of use of mixed techniques. My next example is a poem by Küçük İskender. The poem is entitled Beyaz, White, and it was sculpted by Arzu Parten using mixed techniques. Another example is Bir Camın Ardında Karanlıkça, a poem by Lale Müldür, which was sculpted by Ayhan Mutlu with the same title, which roughly means Standing Dark Beyond the Glass. So what I will be focusing on here is Nâzım Hikmet's poetry in the exhibition. Nâzım Hikmet is a world literary figure and is the most translated poet of Turkish literature. And in this exhibition, with 3 sculptures, he has the highest number of renderings. And I will now look more closely into the renderings of Angina Pektoris, because his poem Yürümek was sculpted by Caner Şengünalp, and 2 different versions of Angina Pektoris were created by Cemil Güç and Çağdaş Erçelik. So I will look at these 2 renderings of Angina Pektoris. Cemil Güç's sculpture is called Nâzım Elması, meaning Nâzım's apple, and is made of Kastamonu stone, depicting an apple with its half cut. Çağdaş Erçelik's work, on the other hand, is called Angina Pectoris, is bigger in size and conveyed by means of mixed techniques, as we will look further into in a minute. In order to further elaborate on these 2 works, I would like to read the English translation of the poem by Randy Blasing and Mutlu Konuk. Angina Pectoris. Excuse me. If half my heart is here, doctor, the other half is in China, with the army flowing toward the Yellow River. And every morning, doctor, every morning at sunrise, my heart is shut in Greece. And every night, doctor, when the prisoners are asleep and the infirmary is deserted, my heart stops at a rundown old house in Istanbul. And then, after 10 years, all I have to offer my poor people is this apple in my hand, doctor. 1 red apple, my heart. And that, doctor, that is the reason for this angina pectoris. Not nicotine, prison, or arteriosclerosis. I look at the night through the bars, and despite the weight on my chest, my heart still beats with the most distant stars. So looking back at Cemil Güç's work, we see simplicity in form and matter. Central to the translation process is simplicity and metaphorization. The use of a single figure and single material, Kütahya stone, and the single figure is the apple, seemingly single figure, of course. Yes, the use of a single figure and single material, Kütahya stone, characterizes the work, his work. The translator-sculptor's main translational decision is metaphorization here, which is twofold. For one thing, the use of the apple metaphor is extracted from the source text and is made central, is located central to the work. However, the color as well as the interior of the figure, apple, also resemble that of the heart. So the interior of the apple is designed in a way that will resemble the muscle tissues of a dissected heart. Çağdaş Erçelik's translation or sculpture, however, seems to result from more intertextual and biographical translational decisions. On the right-hand side, we can see Hikmet's self-portrait dating back to 1949 when he was in Bursa prison. Erçelik's work may be considered as a replica or nazire, an imitation or a creative imitation of Hikmet's self-portrait. The eclectic use of visual techniques as well as the intertextual nature of the work are its distinctive features. Obvious in their sheer distinctive properties, these examples show that the creativity required throughout cross-semiotic recanonization of translated poetry depends more on the interpretation of the translator or artist than the source text. So the translatability is not very much related to or dependent on the source text, but dependent on or defined by the creativity of the interpreter or artist translator. So in conclusion, the translation of poetry into other artistic forms, sculpture in this case, seems to require a kind of creativity that is performative, because sculpting is a performative way of translation, is interventive within the extensive context of the public sphere, actively contributes to the making of urban poetics. Here by urban poetics, of course, I do not mean poetry about urban themes, but the overall poetics of the city itself. When exhibited together, may lead to formation of diverse, special, and unprecedented forms of anthologies, in this case, anthologized in the forms of sculptures. So I take this exhibition as an anthology, both in space, because the exhibition took place in a special setting, and the book that was published after the exhibition makes it a visual anthology of translated poetry as well. So there are two sorts of anthologies in question here. Allows for diversification of artistic expressions, experimentalizations, and non-literary intertextualities. Requires the artist translator to act performatively as an agent not only between science systems, but also across spatial, canonical, artistic, and temporal contexts. Leads to an understanding of translatability not as a source-oriented phenomenon, but as a concept related to the artistic creativity of the artist translator. Thank you very much for your patience, and here are my references. Thank you.